Right, some people in politics and the media see a massive difference still between the way police handled the Capitol Hill breach earlier this month and those Black Lives Matter protests over the past summer. Now, from the way the two events were discussed in the media to the way law enforcement handled those issues, those who were arrested, the left says this is just one more example of our country's hypocritical and racist law enforcement structure. Yes, the left says that the Capitol rioters are getting off easier than the BLM protesters because they're white. You saw the headlines there. Specifically, a woman named Anita Cameron, a veteran black disability rights activist who had been arrested a dozen times prior to protesting at the U.S. Capitol, and she wasn't involved in the event here. But this is what she told Time magazine after the fact. It was white supremacy in action, that they stormed the Capitol in order to halt a constitutionally mandated process because they wanted to change things, knowing that nothing would happen to them. Their whiteness protected them. Of course, we know a lot of these folks are now under federal investigation, and some of them aren't even white. Let's talk more about this now with Larry Elder. In case you don't know, he's the sage of South Central, an attorney and author and host of the Larry Elder Show on the radio. Larry, great to talk to you as always.
You too, John. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, and we don't get to do this enough. Now, is there a difference between the way police handled these two events? I mean, I think you could say so. Here's another headline, too, from NBC News. Quote, the failed response to the Capitol Hill riot shows a deep divide over police use of force. Is this racism thing being used, I think, to maybe obscure the real aspect of this here?
Well, John, I don't know about you, but when I was watching the siege at the Capitol Hill, Capitol building, and it was horrific, my first thought, my second thought, my third thought, my 100th thought was not, my goodness, what would have happened had primarily these protesters been black? I was worried about the safety of the congresspersons. I was worried about the safety of the paintings and sculptures that were in the building. It never occurred to me to do a thought experiment about what would have happened had the protesters been largely black. But if you want to play that game, let's do it. Probably what would have happened, John, is things would have been worse because the cops would have pulled back even more, because study after study after study has shown that the police are more hesitant, more reluctant to use deadly force against blacks than against whites, which of course is completely inconsistent with the narrative that Black Lives Matter, the Democrats, and people like Joe Biden have been running with. The police are very, very worried about being concerned, about being perceived as racist. As a result, study after study, as I mentioned, has shown that the police are more hesitant, taking longer to pull the trigger on a black suspect than on a white suspect. So if you want to play this game, the likelihood is that the majority of them had been black. The police would have been even more hesitant, more reluctant to use any kind of force whatsoever. So probably it would have been worse.
Now, we're going to hear a lot of these same comments coming up during the impeachment trial. We do expect the left to use race as part of their case against Donald Trump. Yeah, that's why we're not going to be surprised when they do here. But I think the danger here is that, so much of this is symbolic, and it, obscures the real conversation we need to have, the conversation you talk about in your documentary with Alan West, who we're going to have coming up here in a little bit. The real things that are going to make the racial tension in this country better. This is not it.
Yeah, we should stop lying. There was an NPR piece just a couple of days ago, big headline, troubling pattern of police shootings of unarmed blacks. I read the article several times. I listened to the interview. Not one word about the fact, F-A-C-T, that more unarmed whites are killed by the police than unarmed blacks are. I defy your audience to name an unarmed white person who's been killed by the police. And the reason is because Van Jones, MSNBC, CNN doesn't give a rip if it's a white person being killed who's unarmed as opposed to a black person being killed who's unarmed. Of all the homicides in this country, there are about 15,000 non-suicide homicides. Half of them involve black victims. The suspicion is almost all of these black victims are killed by other black people. You look at the 7,000 black people killed last year and the 250 black people killed by cops, almost all, by the way, were resisting with the weapon. You're talking about maybe 3% of all the killings of black people last year. If you look at unarmed blacks killed by white cops, you're looking at 0.3%. Most of the blacks who are killed in this country are killed by other young black people, and we're not having a discussion about that. The primary problem facing black America is not racism by cops. It is the fact that 70% of black kids enter the world without a father married to the mother. And Obama said a kid raised without a father is 5 times more likely to be poor and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, 20 times more likely to end up in jail. Now, the discussion we ought to be having is, why has the illegitimacy rate gone from 25% in 1965 for blacks to 70% right now? Why? And I argue that the welfare state has incentivized women to marry the government and has allowed men to abandon their financial and moral responsibility, and we're not having that discussion.
Right. You know, it's something we talk about all the time. It's not a racial issue. A lot of times it comes down to personal responsibility. That's where we want to be. Larry, I know you're always advocating for that. Look forward to talking to you again, and we'll always catch you on the radio in the meantime. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
You just watched Newsmax TV, America's fastest growing cable news channel, now in more than 70 million homes. You can get Newsmax TV on your cable system or check your cable guide. And if your system doesn't carry Newsmax, call them, tell them you want Newsmax TV, because we're real news for real people.